During my daughter's wedding, the groom turned to his boss and introduced me in the most humiliating way possible, calling me an unemployed loser woman. The words cut through the joy of the day, leaving me stunned in front of everyone. I could feel the weight of his insult, but I chose to hold my composure and let the moment reveal more about his character than about mine. The late afternoon sun filtered through the lace curtains of the modest two-bedroom apartment in Queens, casting delicate shadows across the worn but well-maintained furniture. Margaret Maggie Thompson sat at her small dining table, surrounded by wedding magazines and brochures that seemed to mock her with their glossy promises of perfection. At 53, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of a woman who had weathered life's storms with grace, her graying auburn hair pulled back in a simple bun, her hands bearing the calluses of honest work. Across from her sat her daughter, Emily, 26, and radiant with the glow of a woman in love, or at least what she believed to be love. Emily's blonde hair cascaded in perfect waves, a stark contrast to her mother's practical style, and her designer engagement ring caught the light as she gestured enthusiastically through the pages of Modern Bride. "Mom, look at this venue," Emily said, her voice bright with excitement as she pointed to a photograph of an opulent ballroom dripping with crystal chandeliers. "The Hamptons Country Club. Marcus thinks it would be perfect for our reception. It's where all the important people in his firm have their events." Maggie's heart clenched at the mention of Marcus Ashford III, a name that rolled off his tongue with the practiced arrogance of old money, though she suspected his family's wealth was more recent than he let on. She had watched her daughter transform over the past year, trading her comfortable jeans and sweaters for designer pieces that seemed to wear her rather than the other way around. "That's lovely, sweetheart," Maggie said carefully, her voice carrying the slight Irish lilt that emerged when she was emotional. "But have you considered St. Mary's? It's where your father and I were married. The rose garden there is absolutely beautiful in June, and oh, Mom!" Emily's laugh was light but dismissive, a sound that cut through Maggie's heart like a blade. "St. Mary's is so quaint. Marcus says we need to think about the impression we'll make. His colleagues, his boss, these are important people. We can't have our wedding look like some small-town affair." The word quaint hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that made Maggie's cheeks flush with a mixture of hurt and embarrassment. She thought of the yellowed photographs in her bedroom drawer, images of her and Patrick on their wedding day 30 years ago, both of them young and poor, but radiantly happy in that same rose garden Emily now dismissed so casually. "Of course, darling," Maggie said, forcing a smile. "I just thought, well, your father proposed to me in that garden. He said he wanted our daughter to know the place where our love story began." Emily's expression softened momentarily, a flicker of the girl who used to curl up beside her mother on Sunday mornings, listening to stories about her father. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by the polished veneer she'd adopted since Marcus entered her life. "I know, Mom, and that's sweet. But Marcus is right. We need to think practically. His firm represents some of the biggest names in Manhattan. The senior partner, Catherine Sterling, will be there. And Marcus says first impressions matter in his line of work." Maggie nodded, though inside she felt as if she were losing her daughter piece by piece to a world that valued appearances over authenticity. She remembered Patrick's words during Emily's childhood. "Our little girl has a good heart, Maggie. Life will try to change that, but we'll make sure it doesn't." If only Patrick were here now. If only he could see what their daughter was becoming. 3 weeks later, Maggie found herself in the imposing lobby of the Hamptons Country Club, feeling distinctly out of place in her best dress, a simple navy blue number she'd worn to Patrick's funeral 5 years earlier. The marble floors gleamed under the massive crystal chandelier, and everywhere she looked, she saw the kind of understated luxury that whispered rather than shouted its expense. Marcus stood near the reservations desk, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than Maggie's monthly rent. At 32, he was handsome in the way that money often makes men handsome, well-groomed, confident, with the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and his handshake, when he'd first met Maggie, had been firm but brief, as if he were already calculating how quickly he could move on to more important people. "Mrs. Thompson," Marcus said as she approached, his voice carrying that particular tone reserved for children and the elderly, patronizing kindness wrapped in false warmth. "How wonderful that you could make it. I know Emily was worried you might find the drive from Queens challenging." The comment stung more than it should have. Maggie had driven herself to every corner of the 5 boroughs and beyond during her years of building her business, but Marcus didn't know that. To him, she was simply Emily's mother, a widow of modest means who cleaned houses and took on odd jobs to make ends meet. "Not at all," Maggie replied evenly. "I've always been good with directions." Emily appeared beside Marcus, linking her arm through his with the possessive affection of a woman marking her territory. She looked stunning in a cream-colored designer dress that probably cost more than Maggie spent on clothing in a year. "Mom, isn't this place amazing?" Emily gushed, gesturing at the opulent surroundings. "Marcus has already spoken to the event coordinator. We could have the ceremony in the garden pavilion and the reception in the grand ballroom. It would be absolutely perfect." Maggie looked around, taking in the ostentatious displays of wealth, the staff who moved with the practiced deference of those accustomed to serving the privileged, and the other couples touring the facility, all of whom seemed to exist in a world entirely separate from her own. "It's certainly impressive," she said carefully. "What's the cost for something like this?" The question seemed to hang in the air like an unpleasant odor. Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and Emily shot her mother a warning look. "Mom, we've talked about this," Emily said quickly. "Marcus and I have it handled. His bonus this year was substantial, and his family wants to contribute." "I just thought," Maggie continued, her Irish stubbornness rising to the surface, "that perhaps we could look at a few other options. The botanical gardens in Central Park have a lovely pavilion, and the cost would be much more reasonable." Marcus interrupted, his smile becoming razor-thin. "Mrs. Thompson, I appreciate your concern for the budget, but Emily and I aren't looking for reasonable. We're looking for memorable. This is a once-in-a-lifetime event, and I want Emily to have the wedding she deserves." The implication was clear. The wedding she deserves is one her mother couldn't provide. Maggie felt the familiar ache in her chest, the one that had lived there since Patrick's death, now joined by a new pain, the slow realization that she was losing her daughter to a man who saw her as an embarrassment to be managed rather than a person to be respected. "Of course," Maggie said quietly, "I want Emily to be happy." "Then it's settled," Marcus declared, as if Maggie's opinion had been nothing more than a minor obstacle to overcome. "Emily, darling, shall we go look at the bridal suite? I'm sure your mother will be fine waiting in the lobby." As they walked away, Marcus's arm around Emily's waist in a gesture that seemed more possessive than affectionate, Maggie caught sight of their reflection in the polished marble. They looked perfect together, the successful young executive and his beautiful fiancé, both of them golden and confident and utterly convinced of their own importance. For a moment, Maggie allowed herself to imagine what Patrick would say if he were standing beside her. He'd probably make some joke about the chandelier being big enough to house a family of 4, then remind her that love wasn't measured in square footage or crystal fixtures. He'd put his arm around her and whisper that their Emily would come to her senses eventually, that good hearts don't stay buried forever. But Patrick wasn't there, and Maggie was left alone in the opulent lobby, feeling like an intruder in her own daughter's life. The next few weeks passed in a blur of appointments, tastings and increasingly tense conversations. Each decision became a battlefield where Maggie's suggestions were politely dismissed and Marcus's preferences were treated as gospel. When she suggested her late husband's cousin, Father O'Brien, to perform the ceremony, Marcus insisted on the country club's non-denominational officiant. When she offered to contribute her grandmother's Irish lace for Emily's veil, Emily gently explained that she'd already chosen something more contemporary from Vera Wang. It was during a cake tasting at an upscale bakery in Manhattan that the pattern of dismissal became impossible to ignore. Maggie sat in the corner of the pristine white showroom, watching her daughter and future son-in-law sample elaborate confections that cost more per slice than some people spent on groceries for a week. "The buttercream is divine," Emily murmured, closing her eyes as she savored a bite of what the baker called their signature champagne cake with gold leaf accents. "It's acceptable," Marcus said with the air of a wine connoisseur critiquing a vintage. "But I think we should consider the impact." Catherine Sterling mentioned that the Worthington wedding last month had a 7-tier cake with imported Belgian chocolate. "We don't want to appear modest in our choices." Maggie cleared her throat softly. "You know, sweetheart, I still have your grandmother's cake recipe. The one she made for my wedding? It was a simple butter cake with fresh strawberries, but everyone said it was the most delicious." "Mom." Emily's voice carried a note of warning that Maggie had never heard before. "We're not making a homemade cake for our wedding. This isn't a church bake sale." The words hit Maggie like a physical blow. She thought of her mother's careful hands mixing batter, of the love that went into every ingredient, of the way the entire neighborhood had gathered to help prepare food for her wedding, because that's what families did for each other in those days. They showed love through service, not expense. Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying Maggie with the detached interest of someone observing a curious specimen. "Mrs. Thompson, I think you need to understand that Emily and I are building a life together that requires a certain level of sophistication. We appreciate your input, truly, but we're moving in different circles now. What works in Queens might not translate to the expectations we're dealing with in Manhattan." The casual cruelty of his words took Maggie's breath away. Not because they were intentionally vicious, but because they were delivered with such matter-of-fact dismissal, as if her entire life, her values, her love for her daughter were simply irrelevant obstacles to be overcome. Emily shifted uncomfortably in her seat, and for a moment Maggie thought she saw a flicker of the girl who used to defend stray cats and stand up to playground bullies. But then Marcus placed his hand over Emily's, and the moment passed. "Marcus is right, Mom," Emily said, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. "We just want everything to be perfect." Perfect. The word had become Emily's mantra over the past months, replacing the spontaneous joy that had once been her defining characteristic. Maggie wondered when her daughter had decided that the life they'd shared, the Sunday morning pancakes, the movie nights on their worn couch, the simple pleasures of loving and being loved, was somehow insufficient. As they left the bakery with a signed contract for a cake that cost more than Maggie spent on food in 3 months, she made a decision that would change everything. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she hadn't called in years. "Catherine Sterling's office," came the crisp voice of an assistant. "Yes, I'd like to schedule a meeting with Miss Sterling," Maggie said, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "Tell her it's Margaret Thompson calling. She'll know what it's about." The morning of Emily's wedding dawned gray and overcast, as if even the weather sensed the tension that had been building for months. Maggie stood in her small bedroom, staring at her reflection in the antique mirror that had belonged to her grandmother. The woman looking back at her wore a simple but elegant dress in deep burgundy, appropriate for the mother of the bride, modest enough not to draw attention, yet somehow carrying an air of quiet authority that hadn't been there in years. On her dresser lay 2 items that represented the crossroads of her life: a small velvet box containing her grandmother's pearl necklace, the one she'd planned to give Emily as her something old, and a business card with Catherine Sterling's name embossed in gold lettering. The meeting had been brief, just 15 minutes in a coffee shop in Midtown, but it had changed everything. "Are you certain about this, Maggie?" Catherine had asked, her sharp blue eyes studying her old friend with concern. "Once we do this, there's no going back. Emily will know everything." "She already doesn't know me," Maggie had replied, fingering the simple wedding band she still wore after 5 years of widowhood. "At least this way, she'll understand why I made the choices I did." Now, as Maggie fastened the pearl necklace around her throat, she thought of Patrick's words on their wedding day. "Promise me something, Maggie, love. Promise me that if anything ever happens to me, you'll protect our family the way I would. Sometimes that means making hard choices." She'd kept that promise, even when it meant watching her daughter drift away from everything they'd built together. A knock at the door interrupted her reverie. Emily stood in the hallway, radiant in her Vera Wang gown, a vision of bridal perfection that belonged on magazine covers. For a moment, Maggie forgot about Marcus, forgot about the months of tension, and saw only her beautiful daughter on the most important day of her life. "Mom," Emily said softly, "I wanted to give you something before we leave for the church." She held out a small wrapped box, and when Maggie opened it, she found a delicate silver locket engraved with, "For the woman who taught me about love." "Emily?" Maggie's voice caught in her throat. "I know things have been difficult between us lately," Emily continued, her voice wavering slightly. "I know I haven't always listened to your advice, and maybe I've said things that hurt you. But I want you to know that everything I am, everything good in me, comes from you and Dad." For a moment, Maggie considered abandoning her plan. Perhaps she could simply stand beside her daughter today, smile through the ceremony, and hope that marriage would somehow soften Marcus's edges, that love would eventually triumph over ambition. But then she heard Marcus's voice from the living room, sharp and impatient. "Emily, we need to go. The photographer is already at the venue, and I don't want to keep important people waiting." The moment shattered, Maggie saw the way Emily's shoulders tensed, the way her daughter's natural joy dimmed in response to that tone. No, she thought. Patrick wouldn't have let this continue, and neither would she. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Maggie said, fastening the locket around her neck. "I'll treasure it always." The country club had been transformed into a vision of opulent elegance that would have impressed royalty. White roses and peonies cascaded from every surface. Crystal votives cast dancing shadows across linen tablecloths, and a string quartet played softly in the corner. The guest list read like a who's who of Manhattan's legal and financial elite, exactly as Marcus had planned. Maggie sat in the front row, watching as Emily walked down the aisle on the arm of Patrick's brother, Michael, who had flown in from Boston to give her away. Her daughter looked ethereal, but Maggie noticed the slight tremor in her hands, the way her smile never quite reached her eyes. Marcus stood at the altar in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, his posture radiating confidence and satisfaction. This was his moment, Maggie realized, not a celebration of love, but a performance designed to elevate his status among the assembled crowd of influential guests. During the ceremony, Maggie found herself studying the faces around her. There was Catherine Sterling in the third row, impeccably dressed and watching the proceedings with the calculating eye of someone who understood the true nature of power. Near her sat several other faces Maggie recognized from business magazines and society pages, partners from Marcus's firm, clients, potential contacts. How many of these people, she wondered, were here for Emily's happiness, and how many were simply networking opportunities in formal wear? The officiant's words about love, commitment, and partnership seemed to float over the assembly like background music, pleasant but ultimately meaningless. Maggie's heart ached as she watched Emily promise to love and honor a man who had never shown her mother basic respect, who had systematically dismantled her daughter's connection to her own family and values. When the ceremony concluded and the newlyweds processed back down the aisle, Marcus caught Maggie's eye and offered her a smile that was all performance, the gracious son-in-law acknowledging his wife's quaint mother. Emily, radiant in her happiness, squeezed Maggie's hand as she passed, whispering, "I love you, Mom." "I love you too, sweetheart," Maggie whispered back, knowing that in a few hours Emily might not feel the same way. The cocktail hour proceeded with the smooth efficiency of a well-oiled machine. Waiters circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres that probably cost more per bite than most people's lunch, while the guests networked with the practiced ease of people accustomed to mixing business with pleasure. Maggie stood near the windows overlooking the club's manicured gardens, nursing a glass of champagne she hadn't touched and watching her daughter navigate the crowd like a natural hostess. Emily moved from group to group, her smile bright and her conversation animated. But Maggie noticed the way she deferred to Marcus in every interaction, the way she stepped slightly back whenever he began speaking, as if making herself smaller to accommodate his presence. "Mrs. Thompson." Maggie turned to find a tall man in his 50s approaching, his silver hair perfectly styled and his expensive suit marking him as one of Marcus's colleagues. Richard Pemberton, he said, extending his hand. I work with Marcus at Sterling and Associates. Your daughter is absolutely lovely. Thank you, Maggie replied, accepting his handshake. She's always been my greatest joy. Marcus tells me you live in Queens, Richard continued, his tone carrying that familiar note of polite condescension she'd grown to recognize. How quaint. I imagine it's quite different from all this. He gestured at the opulent surroundings. Before Maggie could respond, Marcus appeared beside them, his arm sliding possessively around Emily's waist. Up close, Maggie could see the slight sheen of perspiration on his forehead despite the cool air conditioning, the nervous energy of a man who was trying very hard to manage multiple impressions simultaneously. Dick, I see you've met my mother-in-law, Marcus said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. Maggie, Richard here is one of our senior associates. He's been instrumental in landing several major accounts this year. How wonderful, Maggie said evenly. Emily's always been proud of your professional achievements, Marcus. Something flickered across Marcus's face, surprise perhaps at her gracious response. He'd been expecting awkwardness, she realized, hoping that her obvious discomfort in these surroundings would reinforce his narrative about her inadequacy. Yes, well, Marcus continued, it's important to maintain certain standards in our line of work. Image matters almost as much as competence. The comment was clearly directed at Maggie, a reminder of her place in his carefully constructed social hierarchy. Emily's grip on his arm tightened slightly, a subtle warning that he chose to ignore. Of course, Maggie agreed, her voice mild. I've always believed that people reveal their true character through how they treat others, especially those they perceive as having less power than themselves. Richard chuckled, missing the underlying tension entirely. Wise words. Marcus, you're lucky to have such a philosophical mother-in-law. But Marcus wasn't laughing. His eyes had narrowed slightly as he studied Maggie, perhaps beginning to sense that the meek, overwhelmed widow he'd been dismissing for months might not be quite what she seemed. If you'll excuse me, Maggie said with a gentle smile, I think I'll get some fresh air before dinner. As she walked away, she could feel Marcus's gaze burning into her back, and she knew that the final act was about to begin. The reception began with all the pomp and circumstance Marcus had envisioned. The grand ballroom sparkled under the light of 3 massive crystal chandeliers. Each table was a masterpiece of floral artistry, and the 12-piece orchestra played soft jazz as guests found their seats. Maggie had been relegated to a table, near the back, surrounded by distant relatives and family friends, people Marcus clearly considered of lesser importance than his professional contacts, who occupied the prime real estate closer to the head table. She watched from her assigned exile as Marcus worked the room during the cocktail reception that preceded dinner, his hand perpetually on Emily's back, steering her from one important conversation to another like a prized possession being displayed for admiration. Emily played her part perfectly, laughing at jokes that weren't funny, nodding enthusiastically at conversations about mergers and acquisitions, transforming herself into the ideal corporate wife her husband required. The speeches began after the main course, a succession of toasts from Marcus's fraternity brothers, his colleagues, and his father, each one emphasizing Marcus's ambition, his success, his bright future. When it came time for the traditional mother of the bride speech, Marcus rose from his seat at the head table. Before we continue, he said, his voice carrying easily across the room through the wireless microphone, I want to take a moment to acknowledge someone very special. Emily's mother, Margaret, has been. He paused, his smile becoming razor-sharp. An education for me. She's taught me so much about different perspectives, different ways of living. The words were carefully chosen, delivered with just enough warmth to seem gracious, while carrying an unmistakable undertone of condescension. Several guests chuckled politely, understanding the coded message. Marcus was acknowledging his charity in accepting someone so beneath his social station into his orbit. I know that sometimes our backgrounds can seem incompatible, Marcus continued, his gaze finding Maggie across the crowded room. "But I want Margaret to know that Emily and I appreciate her efforts to contribute to our special day, even when those contributions might seem a little outdated by Manhattan standards." The laughter was louder this time, more confident. Marcus had given his audience permission to join in his gentle mockery of the simple woman from Queens who didn't understand their sophisticated world. "So let's raise our glasses," Marcus said, lifting his champagne flute, "to family in all its various forms." The toast was the final straw. As the room erupted in applause and laughter, Maggie caught sight of Emily's face. Her daughter was smiling, but there was something hollow in her eyes, a recognition of the cruelty in her husband's words even as she participated in the charade. Maggie rose from her seat, the motion causing several nearby guests to turn in her direction. She began walking toward the head table, her steps measured and deliberate, the burgundy dress she'd chosen with such care now seeming to shimmer with an authority that hadn't been there before. "Marcus," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet ballroom, "that was quite a speech." Marcus's smile faltered slightly, but he maintained his composure. "I'm glad you enjoyed it, Margaret. I wanted to be sure you felt included." "Oh, I feel very included," Maggie replied, accepting the microphone that someone, she thought it might have been Catherine Sterling, pressed into her hand. "In fact, I think this is the perfect moment for me to respond." Maggie looked out over the assembled crowd, taking in the faces of Manhattan's legal and financial elite, people who had spent the evening treating her like an amusing curiosity, a quaint reminder of simpler times. Her heart was pounding, but her voice when she spoke was steady and clear. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "I want to thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate my daughter's wedding. It's been illuminating to meet so many of Marcus's colleagues and friends." She paused, her gaze finding Emily at the head table. Her daughter was watching with growing alarm, perhaps beginning to sense that this was not going to be the gracious, self-deprecating response Marcus had expected. "Marcus is right that I've learned a great deal tonight," Maggie continued. "I've learned about the importance of appearances in your world, about the value you place on connections and status. I've learned that a woman from Queens, a widow who cleans houses and takes odd jobs to make ends meet, can be quite entertaining to people who've never had to worry about paying rent or choosing between groceries and medication." The room had gone completely silent now. Even the orchestra had stopped playing. "But I think there's something Marcus forgot to mention in his research about different backgrounds and perspectives," Maggie said, her voice growing stronger. "You see, not everyone is exactly what they appear to be." She turned to face Marcus directly, watching as confusion replaced smugness on his handsome face. 30 years ago, I was indeed a young woman from Queens, working 2 jobs to support myself through business school. That's where I met a brilliant young lawyer named Catherine Sterling." Maggie gestured toward the 3rd row, where Catherine was watching with something that might have been pride. "Together, we had an idea for a different kind of legal consulting firm, one that would focus on helping small businesses navigate complex regulatory environments." Marcus's face had gone pale. Around the room, she could see recognition dawning on several faces, people beginning to put together pieces of a puzzle they hadn't realized they were solving. "We started Sterling and Associates in a 2-room office above a deli in Brooklyn," Maggie continued. "Catherine handled the legal side, and I managed the business operations. We worked 18-hour days, lived on coffee and determination, and slowly built something remarkable." The silence in the room was deafening. Emily had risen from her seat, her face a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. "Over the years, our little firm grew. We expanded into corporate law, mergers and acquisitions, regulatory compliance. We attracted some of the brightest legal minds in the city." Maggie's smile was gentle but implacable. "Including a young associate named Marcus Ashford III, who joined us 5 years ago with impeccable credentials and boundless ambition." Marcus was no longer pale. He had gone completely white, his mouth opening and closing without sound. "What Marcus doesn't know," Maggie said, her voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom, "is that while Catherine has always been the public face of our partnership, I am the majority owner of Sterling and Associates. I am, in effect, his ultimate employer. The gasps around the room were audible now. Chairs scraped as people turned to stare, to whisper, to piece together the implications of what they were hearing. For the past year, Maggie continued, I have watched this man court my daughter, and I have listened to him dismiss everything I hold dear as inadequate, outdated, beneath the standards of important people. I have watched him systematically separate Emily from her family, her values and her own sense of self-worth, all in service of an image he believes will advance his career. Emily had sunk back into her chair, her face buried in her hands. I allowed this charade to continue because I needed to be certain of Marcus's character, Maggie said. I needed to know whether the man who wanted to marry my daughter was someone who could love her for who she is, or someone who saw her as a stepping stone to greater things. She turned back to Marcus, who was now gripping the edge of the table as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. I think we all have our answer, Maggie concluded. A man who would publicly humiliate his wife's mother at their wedding reception is not a man who understands the meaning of family, loyalty, or love. The aftermath of Maggie's revelation unfolded like a carefully orchestrated performance. Catherine Sterling rose from her seat and approached the head table, her expression professionally neutral, but her eyes blazing with controlled fury. Marcus, Catherine said, her voice cutting through the shocked murmurs of the crowd. I think we need to have a conversation about your future with the firm. Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper. Catherine, I didn't know. She never said. No, she didn't, Catherine agreed coldly. Because Margaret Thompson, or should I say, Margaret Thompson Sterling, my business partner for over 3 decades, has always believed that people should be judged by their character, not their bank accounts. Apparently, she was conducting a rather extensive character assessment. Emily stood up abruptly, her chair falling backward with a crash that echoed through the silent ballroom. Mom, she whispered, her voice breaking. Is this true? All of it? Maggie's heart shattered at the pain in her daughter's voice, but she forced herself to nod. Every word, sweetheart. You lied to me, Emily said, her voice rising. My entire life you lied to me about who you are, what you do, what we could have had. No, Maggie said firmly. I protected you. There's a difference. Around them, the wedding guests were beginning to stir, some rising to leave, others pulling out phones to capture what was undoubtedly going to be the most talked-about social event of the season. The carefully orchestrated perfection of Marcus's dream wedding was dissolving into chaos. Marcus, meanwhile, had found his footing again, and with it, his anger. You manipulative bitch, he snarled, abandoning all pretense of civility. Do you have any idea what you've done? This is my career, my life. Your life built on lies and pretension, Maggie replied calmly. Your career advancing through contempt for people you consider beneath you. Yes, Marcus, I know exactly what I've done. You've ruined everything, Marcus shouted, his composure completely shattered. Emily, tell her! Tell her she can't do this! But Emily was staring at her husband, this man she'd promised to love and honor just hours earlier, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. The mask had slipped completely, revealing the entitled, cruel person who had always existed beneath the polished exterior. Security, Catherine called, gesturing to the club staff who had been watching the drama unfold. Please escort Mr. Ashford from the premises. You can't do this! Marcus protested as 2 security guards approached him. This is my wedding. These are my guests. Actually, Maggie said quietly, I believe you'll find that I paid for this reception, which makes them my guests at my event, celebrating my daughter's happiness. Since you seem determined to destroy that happiness, I think it's time for you to leave. As the security guards flanked Marcus, he turned to Emily with a desperation that was painful to watch. Emily, please, don't let them do this to us. We can work this out. We can— Get away from me, Emily said, her voice barely audible, but carrying absolute finality. Just get away from me. The security guards escorted Marcus from the ballroom, his protests echoing down the corridor until they faded into silence. The orchestra, after a moment of uncertain hesitation, began playing again. something soft and melancholy that seemed appropriate for a celebration that had transformed into a wake. Maggie stood in the center of the dance floor, still holding the microphone, surrounded by the wreckage of her daughter's wedding day. She had won, but victory tasted like ashes in her mouth. The penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park was nothing like the modest Queens home where Emily had grown up. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the city below, while original artwork adorned the walls and Persian rugs covered the hardwood floors. It was beautiful, sophisticated, and utterly foreign to the woman Emily thought she had known her entire life. 3 days had passed since the wedding disaster. 3 days since Emily had learned that her mother wasn't Margaret Thompson, the humble widow who cleaned houses and worried about rent, but Margaret Thompson Sterling, co-founder of one of Manhattan's most prestigious law firms and a woman wealthy enough to buy the country club where her wedding had imploded. Emily sat curled in a leather chair by the windows, still wearing the jeans and Columbia University sweatshirt she'd thrown on when she fled her honeymoon. Suite at the Plaza. She hadn't spoken to Marcus since security had escorted him away. His increasingly desperate calls and texts had been ignored, then blocked. She hadn't spoken to her mother either, despite Maggie's gentle attempts to reach out. "I brought tea," Maggie said softly, entering the living room with a service that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Even here, in her own home, she moved with the same quiet grace Emily remembered from childhood. But now there was an added layer of confidence, of belonging, that Emily couldn't reconcile with her memories. "Irish breakfast," Maggie continued, setting the tray down on the coffee table between them. "I know it's your favorite." Emily looked up at her mother, this stranger who shared her face but apparently none of her history. "Is anything about you real?" she asked, her voice hoarse from crying. "Or was it all just an elaborate performance?" Maggie poured 2 cups of tea with steady hands, though Emily could see the pain flickering behind her eyes. "Everything about me is real, sweetheart. The love I have for you, the pride I feel watching you grow into a remarkable woman, the joy I took in our Sunday morning pancakes and our movie nights. None of that was pretense. But this," Emily gestured at the opulent surroundings, "this is who you really are. Not the woman who worried about paying for my college textbooks or worked extra jobs to afford my prom dress." "I did worry about your textbooks," Maggie said quietly, settling into the chair across from her daughter. "Not because I couldn't afford them, but because I wanted you to understand the value of education, of working for what you want. And I did work extra jobs, just not the kind you thought," Emily laughed bitterly. "So what, this was all some kind of social experiment? Let's see how the poor people live?" "No." Maggie's voice was firm, carrying an edge of steel that Emily had never heard before. "This was about protecting you from exactly what happened with Marcus." "Protecting me?" Emily's voice rose. "You humiliated me in front of 200 people. You destroyed my marriage on my wedding day. How is that protection?" Maggie set down her teacup with careful precision. "Your marriage was already destroyed, Emily. I just made sure you could see it." The words hung between them like a challenge. Emily wanted to argue, to defend Marcus and the life they'd been building together. But the memories of the past year kept intruding. All the times he'd dismissed her mother, the way he'd systematically separated her from her old friends, the subtle but constant pressure to become someone else, someone more suitable for his ambitions. "You lied to me for 26 years, Emily said finally. "I omitted certain truths," Maggie corrected. "There's a difference, is there?" Emily's eyes blazed with anger and hurt. "Did Dad know about any of this?" For the first time since the confrontation began, Maggie's composure cracked. "Your father knew everything. He supported every decision I made about how to raise you, how to protect you from the world we could have given you access to." "The world you kept me from," Emily corrected. "The world that would have changed you into someone I didn't recognize," Maggie shot back. "Look at what 1 year with Marcus did to you, Emily. Look at how you started talking about our life together, our values, our family, as if they were embarrassments to be overcome. What do you think 26 years of that world would have done?" Emily fell silent, forced to confront the truth she'd been avoiding. She thought about the woman she'd become over the past year, polished, sophisticated, but somehow smaller than she'd been before. She thought about the way she'd dismissed her mother's suggestions, the way she'd stopped visiting as often, the way she'd gradually distanced herself from everything that had once brought her joy. "I loved him," she whispered. "You loved who you thought he was," Maggie said gently. "And maybe for a while he was that person. But power reveals character, Emily, and Marcus showed you his true character long before the wedding. I just made sure you couldn't ignore it anymore." That evening, as the sun set over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Emily found herself walking through Central Park with her mother. It was something they used to do when Emily was young, before Marcus, before the engagement that had changed everything. But now, instead of the comfortable silence they'd once shared, there was a chasm of hurt and mistrust between them. "Tell me about Dad," Emily said suddenly. "Tell me about your real relationship, not the version you let me believe." Maggie smiled, an expression of such genuine warmth that it transformed her face. "Your father was the most remarkable man I've ever known. When I met him, I was already successful. Catherine and I had built Sterling and Associates into something significant, and I was starting to make the kind of money that changes your life. But Patrick didn't know any of that." They sat down on a bench overlooking the reservoir, the same bench where Maggie used to bring Emily to feed the ducks on Saturday afternoons. "I was exhausted," Maggie continued, "from the pressure of building a business, from the constant need to prove myself in a world that didn't always welcome women. I went to a little Irish pub in Queens one night just to escape, and there was this man playing guitar in the corner, nothing fancy, just simple songs that made people smile." Emily found herself leaning forward despite her anger, caught up in a story she'd never heard before. "He was a carpenter," Maggie said. "He built beautiful things with his hands, and he had this way of seeing the world that was just pure. When he asked me out, I panicked. How could I explain that I owned a company, that I made more in a month than he made in a year? So I didn't. I told him I was a secretary." "You lied to him too?" "For 6 months," Maggie admitted. "And it was the most honest 6 months of my life, because he loved me for who I was, not what I could do for him. When I finally told him the truth, you know what he said?" Emily shook her head. "He said, 'Maggie, I don't care if you own the whole city, as long as you're willing to share a life with a simple man who just wants to make you happy.'" Maggie's voice grew soft with memory. "And that's exactly what he did. Every single day he made me happy. But you gave it up," Emily said. "The business, the money, the success?" "I scaled back," Maggie corrected. "I became a silent partner, let Catherine handle the day-to-day operations while I focused on strategy and long-term planning. I worked from home, I traveled when necessary, but I made sure that our family came first." Emily was quiet for a long moment, processing this new version of her family history. "Why didn't you tell me after he died?" "Because by then you were 21 in college, building your own life. You'd grown up understanding the value of hard work, of treating people with respect regardless of their circumstances, of finding happiness in simple pleasures. You were exactly the woman your father and I had hoped you'd become." Maggie turned to face her daughter directly. "I was afraid that if you knew about the money, about the business, it would change you. And then Marcus came along, and I realized I'd been right to be afraid." "So you let me struggle," Emily said, though there was less anger in her voice now. "You let me take out student loans, work part-time jobs, worry about making rent on my first apartment." "I let you build character," Maggie replied. "I let you learn that you were capable of taking care of yourself, that your worth wasn't dependent on anyone else's approval or support. Those lessons served you well until you forgot them." The accusation stung because it was true. Emily thought about the woman she'd been before Marcus, independent, confident, unafraid to speak her mind. Somewhere along the way, she'd lost that person in favor of becoming someone she thought he wanted. "I don't know how to forgive you," Emily said quietly. "I don't expect you to," Maggie replied. "Not yet, but I hope someday you'll understand that everything I did was motivated by love." A week later, Emily agreed to meet Marcus at a small cafe in Soho, neutral territory where they could have the conversation that would officially end their marriage before it had truly begun. He looked haggard, his usual perfect grooming replaced by wrinkled clothes and stubbled cheeks. The golden boy who had seemed so confident and successful now appeared diminished, almost fragile. "You look terrible," Emily said as she sat down across from him. "I've been fired," Marcus replied without preamble. "Catherine Sterling made it very clear that my services were no longer required at the firm. No one else will hire me. Apparently your mother's reach in the legal community is extensive." Emily felt a flicker of sympathy, quickly suppressed. "I'm sorry to hear that." "Are you?" Marcus's laugh was bitter. "Because I think this was exactly what she wanted. She orchestrated the whole thing, letting me humiliate myself, giving me enough rope to hang myself with." "She didn't make you say those things about her," Emily pointed out. "She didn't force you to treat her with contempt for an entire year." "I was trying to protect you." Marcus exploded, his voice carrying across the small cafe and drawing stares from other patrons. "I was trying to help you see that you could have more than what you grew up with." "More?" Emily's voice was dangerously quiet. "I grew up with a mother who loved me unconditionally, who taught me to value people over possessions, who showed me every day what it meant to be a strong woman. What exactly did you think I needed more of?" Marcus stared at her as if she were speaking a foreign language. "Security, status, the respect that comes with success." "Respect?" Emily laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You mean fear? You mean the kind of power that comes from making other people feel small." "That's not," Marcus began, but Emily cut him off. "You called my mother outdated and inadequate in front of 200 people, she said. You spent months dismissing everything that mattered to me as quaint or embarrassing. You isolated me from my friends, my values, my sense of self, all so I could become the perfect accessory for your ambition. And now you're angry because it turned out she had more power than you? Because your victim wasn't actually a victim?" Marcus's face flushed red. "She made me look like a fool." "No," Emily said, standing up and placing her wedding ring on the table between them. "You did that all by yourself. She just made sure everyone could see it." As she walked away from the cafe, leaving Marcus staring at the symbol of their failed marriage, Emily felt something she hadn't experienced in months: relief. The weight of pretending to be someone she wasn't, of constantly editing herself to fit his expectations, was finally lifting from her shoulders. 3 months passed before Emily was ready to have another real conversation with her mother. During that time, she moved back to Queens, renting a small apartment not far from the house where she'd grown up. She took a job teaching at a local elementary school, rediscovering the joy she'd once found in working with children, in making a difference in small but meaningful ways. It was Catherine Sterling who finally bridged the gap between mother and daughter. "Your mother is miserable," Catherine said bluntly during a lunch meeting at a restaurant in Manhattan. Emily had been surprised by the invitation, but curiosity had won out over caution. "I'm sorry to hear that," Emily replied, though she wasn't entirely sure she meant it. "No, you're not," Catherine said with a slight smile. "And I don't blame you. What she did was brutal, even if it was necessary." "Was it necessary?" Emily asked. "Destroying my wedding, humiliating Marcus in front of all those people?" Catherine studied her with sharp blue eyes. "Let me ask you something, Emily. If your mother had simply told you who she was from the beginning, if you'd grown up knowing about the money and the business, do you think you would have seen through Marcus as quickly as you did?" Emily considered the question. "I don't know." "I do," Catherine said firmly. "You would have wondered if he loved you or your trust fund. You would have questioned every relationship, every friendship, every romantic gesture. You would have become cynical and suspicious the way wealthy people often do. Instead, I became naive and gullible." "You became trusting and genuine," Catherine corrected. "Which are wonderful qualities right up until someone decides to exploit them. Your mother gave you 26 years of authentic relationships, authentic experiences. She let you discover who you were without the weight of expectations or the distraction of wealth." Emily stirred her coffee absently, thinking about the years before Marcus, years filled with real friendships, meaningful work, genuine connections with people who valued her for herself. "She lied to me," Emily said, but the anger had gone out of her voice. "She protected you," Catherine replied. "There's a difference, though I understand why it might not feel that way right now." That evening, Emily found herself standing outside the building where Sterling and Associates occupied 3 floors. She took the elevator to the top floor, where a receptionist who looked young enough to be in high school directed her to the corner office. Her mother's office was nothing like Emily had expected. Instead of the cold corporate efficiency she associated with successful business people, the space was warm and inviting. Family photos covered the desk, pictures of Emily at every stage of her life, pictures of Patrick, even a few of the 3 of them together during happier times. The walls were lined with books, awards, and certificates, but also with children's artwork that Emily recognized as her own elementary school masterpieces. "I was wondering when you'd come," Maggie said from behind her desk, looking up from a stack of contracts. She was dressed in an elegant suit that probably cost more than Emily's monthly salary, but her smile was the same one Emily remembered from childhood. "I needed to see it," Emily said, gesturing at the office. "I needed to understand who you really are." "This is who I am professionally," Maggie replied, standing and moving around the desk. "But the woman who raised you, who worried about your scraped knees and celebrated your victories and held you when you cried, that's who I am too." "Both things can be true, Emily." They stood facing each other across the office, 2 women who shared so much history, but felt like strangers. "I don't know how to trust you again," Emily admitted. "Then don't," Maggie said simply. "Trust yourself instead. Trust your own judgment, your own instincts, your own capacity to build a life that makes you happy. That's all I ever wanted for you." 6 months later, Emily stood in the community center in Astoria, Queens, watching as 30 children between the ages of 8 and 12 worked on their art projects. The after-school program she'd developed had started small, just a few kids from the neighborhood whose parents needed somewhere safe for them to go while they worked. But word had spread, and now they had a waiting list. "Miss Emily," called Maria, a 10-year-old with paint-stained fingers and a gap-toothed grin, "can you help me with my painting?" Emily crossed the room to where Maria was working on a watercolor of her family's apartment building. "It's beautiful, Maria. Tell me about it." "That's my mom's window," Maria pointed to the 3rd floor. "She works really hard to take care of me and my little brother. I want to paint it pretty for her." Emily felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the same feeling she'd had as a child when she'd drawn pictures for her mother. Not knowing that Maggie could have afforded to commission portraits from famous artists, but treasured her daughter's crayon drawings more than any masterpiece. "Your mom is lucky to have someone who sees beauty in everyday things," Emily said, helping Maria mix colors for the sky. "Miss Emily?" called another voice. Emily turned to see her mother standing in the doorway, looking slightly uncertain. It was the first time Maggie had visited the center, though she'd been funding it anonymously since its inception, a fact Emily had only recently discovered. "Mom," Emily said, surprised by how glad she was to see her. "What brings you to our humble operation?" Maggie smiled at the gentle teasing. "I wanted to see what you've built here. Catherine told me it's remarkable." Emily looked around the room at the children working on their projects, their faces focused and happy. "It's not much, but it's mine." "It's everything," Maggie said quietly. "It's exactly what your father and I hoped you'd become, someone who finds meaning in helping others, who values connection over status, who builds something beautiful with her own hands." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the children work. Finally, Emily spoke. "I understand now," she said. "Why you did what you did. All of it. Do you forgive me?" Emily considered the question. The hurt was still there, probably always would be, but it was tempered now by understanding, by the recognition that her mother's choices had been motivated by love rather than deception. "I'm working on it," she said honestly, "but I think we're going to be okay." Maggie's eyes filled with tears she didn't try to hide. "That's all I can ask for." As they stood there together, surrounded by the laughter and chatter of children creating something beautiful from simple materials, Emily realized that this was what wealth really looked like, not the crystal chandeliers and designer gowns, but the ability to provide hope, opportunity, and love to those who needed it most. Later that evening, as they walked through the same Queens neighborhood where Emily had grown up, Maggie told her daughter about the scholarship fund they'd established in Patrick's name, about the small businesses Sterling and Associates helped pro bono, about the quiet ways she'd tried to honor the values he'd taught them both. "I want to be part of it," Emily said as they stopped in front of the house where she'd spent her childhood. "The foundation, the community work, all of it. But I want to do it the way Dad would have, quietly, without fanfare, just because it's the right thing to do." Maggie smiled, seeing in her daughter's face the same determination that had driven her own success, but tempered with the compassion and humility that Patrick had embodied. "I think he'd be proud of both of us," Maggie said, as they stood there in the gathering dusk, two women who had found their way back to each other through pain and forgiveness. Emily realized that sometimes the greatest gift a parent can give a child is the freedom to discover who they really are, even if it means risking everything in the process. The story that had begun with a wedding and a revelation had become something deeper, a testament to the enduring power of love, the importance of staying true to one's values, and the possibility of redemption even after the deepest betrayals. In the end, Maggie's greatest success wasn't the business she'd built or the wealth she'd accumulated, but the daughter she'd raised, a woman strong enough to love completely, wise enough to recognize deception, and brave enough to start over when necessary. And that, Emily thought as she hugged her mother goodnight, was worth more than all the crystal chandeliers in Manhattan.